Welcome. Pardon me. I'm Jerry Bird, President of Baltimore Sister Cities, and I'd like to thank all of you, members, colleagues, friends, and special guests for joining this very important discussion tonight. For those of you not familiar, BSC is a nonprofit volunteer organization that aims to promote mutual economic development, educational, cultural, health, and environmental and other cooperation and exchanges between Baltimore City, Maryland, and our international sister cities. We are a global neighborhood of committees that represent Alexandria, Egypt, Changwon, South Korea, Banga, Liberia, Kawasaki, Japan, Luxor, Egypt, Piraeus, Greece, Rotterdam, the Netherlands, and Xiamen, China. Our BSC Diversity webinar series is highly focused on issues and challenges that are important to Baltimore City. Tonight, our purpose for facilitating this webinar is to shed light on why people are hungry. We are proud to bring you 3 speaker panelists who work tirelessly to build food sovereignty in our city. With us tonight is Holly Freishtat, Food Policy Director and Chief of Food Policy for Baltimore City's Planning Division. Meg Kimmel, Executive Vice President and Chief Strategy Officer of the Maryland Food Bank, and Eric Jackson, Founder and Servant Director of Black Yield Institute. But before we begin, I'd like to also thank my 2 BSC co-hosts, Karen Leggett, Vice Chair of Baltimore Luxor Alexandria Committee, who is our digital administrator for the evening, and our moderator, Dr. Teresa Leslie, Vice Chair of Baltimore Rotterdam Committee. Teresa is an anthropologist, community engagement specialist, and educator. Her particular expertise lies in public global health and well-being, sustainable development and the environment, and especially as it relates to underserved populations in both national and international contexts. Without further ado, I'll pass the baton to Teresa, who will kickstart our discussion tonight. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jerry. Before we really get started, we want to just mention some housekeeping rules. What we will do is we will have the 3 speakers present, each one in a row, and afterwards we will take questions. So Karen, would you please explain how they'll be able to ask questions later on?
Sure, please post your questions in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. All the questions can go there. That will simplify our making sure that we reach all of your questions, and we'll go to them after each presentation. Each presenter has had a chance to speak. Closed captions are available. You can click that on the bottom of your screen. It says closed caption, and then you'll be able to see the captions. Watch the chat for links that may be mentioned by our speakers or to other BSC events that we'll post at the end. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Karen. And I want to say first, before we get into the speakers, I want to leave most of the time for them, that this is an issue that I have noticed both internationally and nationally. This issue of food resilience and food insecurity. In my opinion, there's no reason for it, but I think our speakers here are going to talk about what they're doing and some of the origins of food resilience and how to build a food insecurity, I should say, and how to rebuild food sovereignty, which I think is a very important concept. So our first speaker will be Holly Freishtat. And once again, she's the Food Policy Director and Chief of Food Policy and Planning Division at the Baltimore City Department of Planning. She created the Baltimore Food Policy Initiative, an intergovernmental collaboration that aims to address food policy systems. She has spent over 2 decades working on food issues in a variety of contexts, experiences that have provided her with an understanding of the food system from the perspective of food policy strategist, nutritionist, educator, and grower. I'm going to leave it at that, Holly, because you've done so much more, but then I'll just keep reading and reading. So I would like to give the floor to you, Holly.
Great. Good evening, everyone. Just give me one moment to share my screen, please. Okay, that was pretty smooth.
Holly, can you please swap your
Swap your
display
screen.
settings? Swap it. Thanks.
Oh wait, I need to swap it. Sorry.
That's okay.
I guess it doesn't save. Bear with me one moment, please.
It's under display settings.
Yeah,
There it
Swap.
goes. Yeah,
there we go. I apologize.
that's okay.
Okay, we're ready to go. Okay, so real quickly, so I'm the food policy director and I have a staff of a food resilience planner, food access planner, and food systems planner. And together we oversee the Baltimore Food Policy Initiative, which has 3 key pillars. It has our interagency collaboration, our food policy action coalition, and our resident food equity advisors. Together, we are building an equitable and resilient urban food system. Some guiding principles are looking at supporting policy, data, and programs to create an equitable food system, looking at amplifying the local food economy, creating agricultural land use policies that encourage urban farms and local food production and tenure, and increasing food resilience at household, community, and food system levels. To be able to do that, there is no one solution. It's not a magic bullet of being able to bring a grocery store into a certain location or have an urban farm in any one place. It's about a multi-pronged strategy, which we have a healthy food environment strategy, which first and foremost is resident-driven processes and engaging and working with community to be able to develop out the strategies. So I want to define food resiliency for today's conversation because resiliency can mean many things depending on who is speaking about it and when. So to anchor this conversation, we are in a pandemic. So meaning that we're going to talk about what does resiliency look like in a pandemic. So you can see the first figure there that you see the flat line where it says food insecurity. Well, prior to the pandemic in Baltimore City, we already had high food insecurity. You know, we already had 1 in 4 residents who were on food stamps or SNAP. We already had issues of food insecurity, and then COVID comes, right? And so what we're looking at with resiliency is the ability to not only, in Baltimore's case, go back to where we were, but that's not good enough here. We have to go above it because we were food insecure to start. So when we're talking about resiliency, our shock right now is COVID-19, and how do we recover and do better than we were before we even started? And the pathway to do that is for Baltimore, it has been in preparedness. We have a food resiliency plan that was already established multiple years ago. We already have an emergency operation procedure plan on how to operate in times of emergencies such as a pandemic. So I'm going to speak about the pandemic and our COVID-19 food response, what it looked like before, who was hungry then, who is hungry now, what are we doing now, and what will we be doing later. So with that, we've been doing food environment mapping for a very long time, for over a decade. You will see here on this map, the first one is our healthy food priority areas. It was once called a food desert. The definition has not changed, but the frame has. And we're really looking at the main reason we changed it was residents said it is unjust, that definition. It's not naturally occurring in space and structural racism and history of redlining. Focus in on what you're going to do about it, which is healthy food priority areas. What you can see here is 146,000 residents are living and impacted by food insecurity, living in food deserts or healthy food priority areas. Now COVID hits. Overnight, we go from 146,000 people to close to actually 195,000 people are on food stamps right now on SNAP. So our numbers, our data became irrelevant during COVID because everyone was unemployed. So all this mapping we did was not going to be a good indication of how we need to proceed forward. So if you look to the map to the right, we started to map SNAP monthly because it was the most relevant data. And you can see there's a significant increase in food insecurity. Prior to COVID-19, we had 1 in 3 residents on SNAP food stamps, and 1 in 4, excuse me. And now we have close to 1 in 3. So you can see a very drastic increase during COVID-19. And so one of the key things that we need to do, being a part of the city, is making sure that the mayor, city council, and state legislature are all briefed on the food environment, understand the changing food insecurity issues in the city. And so we have briefs. We've had briefs prior to COVID, and then we had to create all new briefs during COVID. So I want to talk briefly about what are we doing. So first and foremost, because food insecurity and people who are food insecure is actually higher risk for transmission of COVID-19. And because of that, we developed an entire strategy based off of mitigating COVID-19 transmission through addressing food insecurity. And so the key factors to understand there is our entire strategy was based in neighborhoods, keep people local, do not have them move when possible, outdoor distribution, having many different days. We want to keep people from congregating in one place. Focusing in on, because we understood the food environment, we knew that there was not a lot of healthy food availability, produce, perishable products. So we focused on that and home delivery. As a result, we will have a $14.7 million reimbursement from FEMA for all our food box distribution because we based it off of a mitigation strategy of COVID-19. So the city is not paying for the food that we're providing, but we're doing a mass distribution in small scale increments. Just quickly, we are focused on federal meals. We had over 9 million meals served in 1 year with youth and kids. We distributed food boxes, 18 million, and the majority, I'll talk about this, is on produce and perishable products, maximizing federal benefits, and also building food system resilience through urban agriculture, and secured over $1 million to support organizations to do so. So talking about urban ag and local food resiliency, so much of our strategy is around just getting people fed right now. We're in a pandemic. This has the greatest impact we can do. Investing in our farms and in community food resiliency now for lasting impact, this will have a lasting impact. The food is because we must meet basic needs. So we're supporting urban farms, farmers markets, and community support agriculture are essential businesses. And we have healthy food priority area funds that we've administered. 82,000 have gone to urban farms and community-based organizations. Okay, so now I want to talk a little bit just high level on numbers. And I think it's really interesting. So one of the questions I was asked is, how do you work with community? So I would say that during COVID, we work more with community than we ever have because we're in direct food response. And so you can see here, we developed out a strategy where our focus is supporting community organizations first and foremost. So just to give you perspective, we're delivering approximately 18,000 produce boxes and food boxes a week, and the majority of them are going to 106 sites. So once again, disaggregated, community-based produce distribution all throughout the city. Second one, and I think this is my favorite slide, is our focus is nutritional food security. So 75% of our food is in produce, meat, and dairy, and we have 55.6 million servings of fruits and vegetables, which means every resident living in a healthy food priority area can have an additional serving of fruits and vegetables for the entire year. I just wanted to show the majority of the people benefiting from meals has been youth and then older adults. SNAP, if this is something that people want to ask me questions later, I'll be happy to talk about it, but you can see this huge dip. It's because of public policy. There was a policy that disqualified residents. It was changed under the Biden administration, and now SNAP is providing the safety net it needs to be. And so to conclude, I want to talk about what's happening right now and where we're going. So first and foremost, we have been doing a produce strategy and food box distribution, and that will continue through June 30th and probably beyond. Our work is dependent on FEMA. So as long as we're in federal emergency, we will be providing boxes. So right now it's through June 30th, and we will let everyone know as it continues. Next steps is really to understand and take note on what we have lived through during this pandemic and make sure that we change our operations and procedures based off of what we've learned to build community food resiliency. The challenge we are facing right now is we are still in full COVID-19 emergency food response. My team has been 100% redirected to food security and food assistance since COVID has started. And so it's very hard for us to be in direct feeding while developing and planning community food resiliency strategy, which is where we are going. How do we support community organizations to meet the needs that they have in the short term and the long term? And so in order to do that, we're going to continue to address food insecurity. We need to Now that we see that produce has worked so well when it's being paid for by others, is to support ways for that to continue through policy. Produce RX, through insurance companies to be able to reimburse people and help them with produce and healthy foods if they're food insecure and having health issues. Continuing to support the resident-led projects and programs, and continuing to support amplifying the local food economy through co-ops, food procurement, and the public markets. With that, there's resources attached if you need to find food resources for yourself or to learn more information. So thank you very much.
And thank you, Holly. Hopefully you can, if we can provide some of those links to some of send it out to the audience that's attending now. Our next speaker will be Meg Kimball. She is the Executive Vice President and the Chief Strategy Officer at the Maryland Food Bank. Meg Kimball has led programs, marketing, fundraising at the Maryland Food Bank in a variety of different roles. As of January 2021, that's relatively recently, so congratulations, you're the head of the food bank. Well, in 2021, the food bank began to recover from the impact of COVID-19, which is a big issue right now because COVID-19 really presented a challenge when people lost their job, when children were no longer going to school where they were getting meals. And that was actually the initial thinking behind this panel, was to develop this talk on food resilience because it's such an important issue in Baltimore. So Meg was named the MFB's Chief Strategy Officer, building on her previous responsibility as Executive Vice President for Programs and External Affairs. As the Executive Vice President, Meg works closely with MFB's CEO to ensure that the food bank's reach and expertise is fully leveraged to help end hunger in Maryland. So I introduced you, Meg Kimball. Thank you. Is Meg frozen?
It appears so. Did she drop?
Okay, so then we'll go back to Meg. Eric, you're gonna have to be up next. So let me introduce Eric Jackson, who is the founder and servant director of the Black Yield Foundation. The Black Yield Institute is an emerging Pan-African institution based in Baltimore. And I'm just gonna say BYI endeavors to build independent power by establishing an action network and incubator with a community of and for Black people and entities in pursuit of Black food sovereignty. And it states that they are unapologetically a Black-led institution, utilizing Afrocentric, Pan-African, and human rights frameworks to anchor their thoughts and work towards liberation through food. So welcome, Brother Eric.
Peace and good evening, everybody. Meg, I hope your technical issue gets solved soon. And if you feel like you want to move forward, I will yield. Thank you for the opportunity. I want to just couple quick corrections. So I am a co-founder. I have not at any point of the development of Black Yield Institute done this work by myself. I am clear that the only way that we're going to liberate ourselves is through collectivism, but also through collective and direct action. So I want to share with you all a bit in my prepared remarks, but also kind of speak a little bit to some of the things that Holly talked about, making some connections and then also raising some challenges. Meg, you want to go?
No, I think you should keep going. I'm having some internet trouble, so you've got the floor. Thanks, Eric.
Yeah, not a problem. So I am a servant director of Black Yield Institute and have been at this work for over about 8 years now. In terms of Black Yield Institute, I've been in this space doing this work for over 10 years now. learning a lot. And I will say that conversations like these are happening more and more. And when I first started doing this work as a young grasshopper in this space, these weren't conversations that were had. And actually, the reason why Black Youth Institute, as a grassroots organization building power in our city, is because these conversations weren't happening, and because Black voices and Black bodies were not leading and at the center of the work. And so, while that is still a pursuit, and while that is, and it's a pursuit, I think, for obvious reasons, but if it's not so obvious for those who are joining, there are white institutions and white people who are largely running and having a say in terms of how people access food, where it comes from, who's benefiting from it economically, politically, and socially. And so our aim seeks to, or our aim is to build power, because we believe that at the very core of the issue of food insecurity, and I'll talk about that in a minute, food apartheid is actually an issue of power, not an issue of access. Access is a symptom of power and imbalances of power. So I want to kind of retract and not retract, but kind of do a backflip and talk about the work of Black Youth Institute just very shortly. We are an organization that operates in two, I would say, gourds or buckets, if you're more familiar with that. And they make up 5 initiative areas that we're operating from. The 2 gourds or 2 approaches really speak to, for us, what we feel is the necessary way that we have to approach the issues that we're facing, and that is in direct response to food apartheid and in building movement toward Black land and food sovereignty. So what that means ultimately, in very simplistic terms, is that what we're hoping to do is respond to the ways in which people are impacted by various forms of white supremacy, and the ways in which and how it kind of is codified through policy, and how it shows up in terms of food access and lack of control of land and food resources and community. But also, it's not important for me. I don't think that it's not important enough for us to just consider where what we're responding to, but we want to also consider where we're going, right? What do we want to see in the world, and how do we create that? And so that other work is building movement. So in our kind of gourd of addressing food apartheid, what we are doing is twofold. We are stewarding an urban agriculture project at what we call, and what we're privileged to call, Cherry Hill Urban Community Garden in South Baltimore. We grow food. We are providing agricultural skills to volunteers and to community garden collectives. And we're also holding space for community community building through political education, through quarterly cultural celebrations on the land, with the hope, and I'll talk about that later, of restoration. That is the theme of our work. When we talk movement, that's what we're talking about: restoring relationships, and I'll talk about that later. But in the other gourd of our work, which is building movement toward Black land and food sovereignty, it includes, I didn't even finish the other one, I apologize, urban agriculture and food cooperative development. We're working on establishing a cooperatively owned grocery store that will be, when it is established and brick and mortar, owned and controlled by members of the community, and largely by Black people in South Baltimore. That is the aim, particularly in a community where we are, where our offices and where our work is headquartered is in Cherry Hill community. And if you haven't, seen it, I'm biased clearly, and I wear it on my sleeve. So what I am hoping that people recognize, and the distinctions, is that the work is about how do we get folks food right now, and how do we organize ourselves and build upon the African-centered and African-American traditions that allow us to, one, meet very real needs, but that also allow us to affirm ourselves while doing so, and not aborting where we come from and utilizing approaches that that are central to our cultural underpinnings. So that's the work of really addressing insecurity and lack of availability of food in community, and the impacts of food apartheid, which again I will explain in a second. And then our movement building work is related to political education, to what we call Black food research and knowledge creation. We are contributing to how people are thinking about things. And lastly, action network building with the understanding that if we are actually going to move to any modicum or establish even a fraction of what it might look like to obtain and materialize Black land and food sovereignty in this city or anywhere, you have to do it with groups. Black Yield Institute is not by far the only organization doing this work, and there are many organizations in the so-called grassroots or so-called grass tips that are doing this work, and not doing it by the kind of standard rules that you're supposed to go by. So that is our work in a nutshell. While we started our work, I started to explain that, but I will kind of talk about these concepts that have very real implications. And so we contend that the way that we understand problems in our society directly impacts the ways in which we go about solving those problems, right? And so this is, and let me just quick note, Holly and I haven't been on a panel together in a long time, and we and behind closed doors and now publicly, me and Holly have for years have been like, hey, we are gonna push, each other. We're gonna support each other. This is, I'm just saying it to say this is one of those moments where I'm gonna push on the notion that Holly talked about, because I think she appreciated it, but I don't want nobody to perceive it as an attack. I happen to be a Black man on this panel, and I don't want it to be perceived wrong, but I am going to challenge it. And Holly said something that I think was really important because it gave me a launching point, I think, to talk about food apartheid. And she talked about healthy food priority areas. The definition hasn't changed, but the frame has. I contend that the definition and the frame has to change if we're going to make any real changes that bring about food resilience, food resistance, and food revolution. I believe that our movement work has to do all three of those things. And I think that to that point, the way that we, when I say we, I mean the grassroots around the country and throughout the world, talking about the language of food apartheid. And food apartheid, from our perspective, is a deeper issue that really speaks to the historic and contemporary existence of the self-destruction of Black and brown and poor people's right to control the food system or food environment or food environments that are directly around us. And that is a recognition that there is a need to understand that what we have, one, is not normal. It is based in principles that come out of capitalism and ultimately a symptom of white supremacy, in the same way that police brutality, poor education, poor schools, sexism, and other issues come from these ideas and these threads of white supremacy. Food apartheid is a manifestation of white supremacy in the space of land and food. And so and we contend that if it is true that the American dream is for people to, control their environments and have all the pursuits and the rights that we are to have, that food and land resources are another area. And in areas where we live, and particularly where I grew up, and in other in the Black butterfly in this city, many people are relegated to having other people decide when we can have food, what kind of food is available, and who benefits from that food. And so it is the understanding that because the issues are not just about availability of food, and it is about power, we can't just stick a grocery store there because that doesn't change the power dynamics. What you end up seeing is that if we focus and have a frame that actually says that, you know what, the way that we solve these issues is by bringing a food pantry or bringing, food aid at large, or even engaging in expanding food retail, I would say that that is a strategy that perpetuates capitalism and still further um, further codifies the dependence on markets, when we know that throughout the world, most people actually do not get their food from a supermarket. They get it from marketplaces, and that are closely connected to community control. So that is a bit of how we understand food apartheid, and knowing that there are economic, social, cultural, spiritual, and other impacts on people's lives, in so much that, in the same way that we talk about healthy food priority areas, or what happened in so-called healthy food priority areas, that we have premature mortality and morbidity that is, we believe, a direct result of, again, white supremacy, right? The same thing that Holly talked about people who are food insecure are those who are also susceptible to COVID. I'm going to translate that for you. Black people and brown people and poor people, right? And so we're talking about the complex nature of oppression and how it plays out, and the ways in which imperialism plays out. So with that being said, the question then is, what do we do to change that? Our thought is that we have to pursue not just, again, food aid. Food aid can be it is useful when a part of a strategy, but food aid by itself actually perpetuates the same system that creates the problem. I'll remind folks, or share with folks, if you don't know, that imperialism historically and contemporarily happened in ways that were, and I'm sure I'm going to probably get shot in the pinky toe for this one and slapped on the wrist, but it happened through the scriptures and through the sword. It didn't just happen through violence that was physical, it happened through violence that was also psychological as well. That's how food apartheid shows up in ways that, that we don't have time to talk about that. And to borrow from what Holly says, if you want to ask me questions about how food apartheid shows up, let's talk about that. But what we believe, that the way that we address the underlying issues and these political issues that's based on power, is to build power, not to put new and fancy stores and things like that. We want to restore power and or build power in places, and that's where the language of Black land and food sovereignty comes from, which ultimately means controlling the food and land resources in the communities where we live, work, worship, and play. And so our hope is, in all of those areas that we talked about, that we are, in addition to that, building movement so that people have more say in what happens, that we're able to produce more food in our community, that we are able to have control of more land in our community, that we're able to decide what is available and what stores are available, rather than being extracted from, right? Our wealth and our labor and our genius being extracted from. We need to organize, and it has to be by virtue of principles of liberatory organizing. It has to be led by the people directly impacted by the issues, led by the oppressed. Borrowing from the works of Paulo Freire and Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And so that doesn't mean we don't work in concert with other people, but that means that we have to lead it, and folks have to move at the terms that work for us, in our terms. And so that's why I say that the relationship that we have with Baltimore Food Policy Initiative and other folks who are, well-meaning white folks connected to white institutions, work with us. And if I can say, Holly, there are many times that something is coming down the pike, and Holly's like, that might not be her language, but bro, I need you to talk to me. Am I right on with this, or am I not? And we have that kind of relationship. But I think that when we talk about sovereignty, it is about that kind of control, not just about the food, but also control our own language, our own terms, in our own terms. And so if I were to close out, what I would say is that to the question of why people are hungry, I think I addressed that. I think it's because of oppressive systems that we haven't changed. It's not because we don't have institutions. I would argue that where I come from are overly resourced, but we are underpowered, right? So our work is to build power and to figure out how to change that so that next generation, just like generations before, were having similar conversations on different platforms. If we're going to change that, we got to build power. And any vision of sovereignty has to include land reparations. It has to include people being at the forefront of policies that make changes to our lives, not just representatives. It entails structural change that comes from the people themselves. And it entails various responses that come, I think, ultimately come from the grassroots in concert with others. And for me, I believe that in closing, that we got to be able to respond to the times, because every social movement is about moving with the times of the people. And I think that now is the time, just like we're doing here, really challenging this notion of resilience and what it looks like. But I think that the exemplary models of resilience are my people. They're the Black and poor and brown people who have figured out how to make a dollar out of 15 cents. So the question for me is not about how do we establish resilience. The question is, how do we move our food aid efforts into efforts that are connected strategically to efforts that will build power and ultimately get to some sense of equity, some sense of sovereignty that is led by the people. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eric. And I really appreciate you talking about oppression. And it's interesting that this is really a time to talk about it, because not only are we talking about food resilience, but we're also talking about white supremacy now. And it's time to combine these arguments. So Meg, I hope we'll get through this, because it seems like you're having a little bit of trouble with your internet. Do you want me to reintroduce you, or do you just want to go?
I can just go. Can everyone
Okay.
hear me okay? Yeah.
For
sounds
now,
like
yes.
it. Yeah. Is it, Teresa, could you possibly show my slides, or I can just talk through it? If that's
Karen
not gonna
has,
work.
if you sent a copy of Karen can show your slides,
Mhm.
yes.
Okay, or I'm happy to talk through it, and I'll kick it off while you're seeing if that's possible. And
Okay.
I was actually happy not to be going after Brother Eric, and so now I'll just have a moment of appreciation for the chance to do that, and I just want to honor his words and Holly's words, and just talk about how inspiring it is to be here with all of you, but especially with the two of you, and that I think that food bank. I work with the Maryland Food Bank. I've been there for many years. Food banking is in a state of flux. It's an entity, a sector of organizations that is really just 40 years old, and so it started off with one woman's inspiration to take care of her neighbors, and it has spawned a very large set of organizations across the country that do food assistance work. And what we say inside the food bank network is if you've seen one food bank, you've seen one food bank. So there are food banks that are very much on the cutting edge of talking about ending poverty and as a way to provide food security. There are other food banks that are not quite as progressive. So I can only speak about our organization here in Maryland, and we are a statewide organization. We cover the entire state of Maryland, with the exception of Prince George's and Montgomery County, which is an opportunity for us. Most states have multiple food banks, so then you get into this whole other set of work around trying to collaborate. So we have a real opportunity here, and one of the opportunities is just what you're seeing here tonight, to get committed people and ideas together and figure out how to move resources around to really build food systems that work for everyone. So I will just kick off with that. And I did want to say that in an effort to sort of just make sure that everyone is listening, who's listening in, has the same understanding of food insecurity, food security. I did want to just start off with this slide. I think the one before this is the food insecurity definition. Well, we'll start with food security. So it's a household measure that means, and this is a USDA definition, that means that all people at all times have enough access to enough food for a healthy life. And that really includes, at its core, the ability to access nutritionally sound foods. So that's a really important, an important theme for us at the food bank, and I'll come back to that later on in my remarks. So let's just roll through one more. Yep. So one of the things about food security is that it's easy to measure and it's hard to achieve. We're awash in data around this from multiple data sources. Most of it is 2 years old, 10 years old. It's very hard to keep track of real current data in this work and have it work for you. So this is an area that we spend a lot of time in at the Maryland Food Bank. I think Holly showed you some of the maps that her team has done. They're just fantastic. And those are great tools, and we also work very hard to make sure that we have a way to visualize food insecurity and it's a way to direct our resources, right? So as an organization that spans most of the state of Maryland, we could be working in a lot of places, but how do we know where to go? How do we know where there's communities that may lack access because they don't have local access to food resources, or there may be people there that lack the ability to access food for other reasons. So we use mapping quite extensively to understand, to make sure that we are doing as much as we can to get the right kind of food to the right folks in the right way at the right time. And so I did just want to underscore that, the USDA definition of measurement. So it's all about whether a family or a household has the financial resources to access food and the right kind of food to live a healthy life. So at its core, even the United States Department of Agriculture is acknowledging that, just 1 second before we go forward, even the United States Department of Agriculture is acknowledging that a lack of financial resources can be a primary driver of food insecurity. So that goes directly back to what Brother Eric was just saying. Yep, so now we can jump ahead. I wanted to just talk a little bit about typically we're seeing, and this is before COVID and certainly exacerbated and expanded greatly by COVID, is who is typically food insecure. If you look at the data, it'll show you that female-headed households is top of the list. And then it'll show you now, and this is this trend has gotten much worse with COVID, families with children. So we know that that families, sometimes people are having to now working.
Okay, we have an issue with bandwidth, I think.
Kids are out of school, so that situation has gotten much worse. Seniors is another category that has really COVID, but in terms of their ability to restore. Okay, I'll try that. Is that coming through now? I'm just checking sound. Can you still hear me?
It's coming through. Yeah, right now it is.
Okay, great. All right. So let's just jump to the next slide, and I'll keep rolling. So one of the things that happened, just in terms of, Holly talked a little bit about the numbers in Baltimore City. So when you look at those same numbers across the state of Maryland, even before COVID, we were estimating that 1.5 million Marylanders were food insecure. Maryland's a state of just over 6 million people, so that's a very high number. We use a combination of data sets. You can see that on the slide. I won't go into details there. But now, and let's jump to the next slide, post-COVID, estimates are showing that around 2 million Marylanders are now classified as food insecure. And so that's a very high number. That's a 1 in 3. That's the same number that Holly is citing in Baltimore City. And we know that that's episodic, but we also know that the drivers of food insecurity now include job loss and lack of wages, underemployment, unemployment. And so that, coupled with the impact on kids and seniors, is really very significant and will require a lot of time and energy and talent for the years to come. So let's go one more slide up, I think, and that should. Yep. So this talks a little bit about. I'll leave this up for a second. This talks a little bit about the ALICE data, which is United Way's data, which they categorize food insecurity not by people who live a certain percentage above the federal poverty level, which is an absurdly low number, but it's something called a survival budget, which includes a lot of things that people need to survive and live and thrive, including haircuts and cell phones and things that we all take for granted. And so you can see there that that Maryland is a state that's very expensive. Baltimore is no different, and that just there's just people just don't have the incomes to rise above the category of food insecurity. And so let's jump to one more. Yep, so we talk a little bit about the food systems and how to build a better food system for Maryland. So let's go on to the next slide. And so here on this slide, you know, is a good, and let me just make sure that I'm tracking along with you so I can make sure I'm talking about the right slide. But yeah, this is a great slide that just shows sort of the dichotomy of work that the Maryland Food Bank is undertaking right now. So right, traditional food banking would have us expanding the capacity of our network of community-based partners, and we have a lot of them across the state, to distribute more food, but to distribute, you know, fresh produce and protein and dairy, like Holly's talking about, you know, requires the right kind of, they have to have refrigerators and freezers and vehicles. And so we're doing that work. We're helping community-based organizations have the resources that they need to distribute not only shelf-stable food, but also fresh produce and proteins. At the same time, now that COVID has lessened its grip on the food bank to some degree, and we have changed from being an organization, we basically doubled in size in terms of the amount of food we're distributing, but we've normalized that activity. And so we are now getting back to some of the work that we had really been focusing on in late 2018, 2019, which is work to address the root causes of food insecurity and help more people become food secure. And so that looks like working with individuals one-on-one to address whatever barriers they may have to food security and helping them navigate that process. So some of the things that are listed on the slide there are the tools that we use to, and we're building that inside our organization to be able to continue to do that work even more so than we do today. And so the next slide is, you know, there's a quote that I really like, which is, we can't food bank our way out of the impact of COVID, right? Food banking is a tactical, transactional, if you're handing food to someone, helps for today, but it doesn't solve any of the underlying reasons that people are food insecure that you've heard of here today. So we are very committed to evolving our organization and working in partnership around policy change, which is something that we have relied on some of our colleague organizations to really shoulder the work there. We're really energized by new partnerships like the one we have formed with Holly and her team and other counties across the state. You know, allows us to not all do the same thing over and over again while we're just sitting side by side, but we can share resources, we can share talent, we can plan together. And we too are very committed to investing in local agriculture, and whether that's neighborhood level or the state level, which we do some of that work already today, and making sure that we are intentional about where our contract dollars are going, and that we are working with Black and brown farmers as much as we can. And this is a new idea for us. And I'd say, Brother Eric, you were the first person that inspired this in me when I met you about a year ago at that distribution in Cherry Hill. So I appreciate your your leadership and thoughtfulness there. Just then there's some of the basic statistics there at the bottom that show you some of the work that we've done over the last year. And then I'll just finish by saying that I think the COVID-19 has, the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on communities of color, on people of color, and the national reckoning that we've had around systemic racism have been much discussed inside the Maryland Food Bank and inside the Food Bank Network, but I'm not speaking for any other organizations, just our own here. And that it has really opened our eyes and has allowed us to commit to being intentional, to being good allies, to making sure that our resources are going toward building an equitable, resilient food system for more people than exists today. So thank you for the opportunity again to be part of this panel and to be here with all of you.
Thank you so much, Meg. Really appreciated. So if you have questions now, you can put them in the chat and then I will go through them. But I just wanted to throw something out there quickly before I start going into the chat. What I found is the difference between an abundance economy and a scarcity economy. So historically, especially among African-American communities during Reconstruction, you could say, these were landowning communities or just communities in general. People took on an abundance economy. And this was the economy where you don't have a lot of money, but you're growing foods, you're not starving, let's put it that way, and you're sharing foods. Going back to the idea of capitalism, that's the economy of scarcity. When things are scarce, things get more expensive, including your food. And this is really a relatively new, and compared to human history, a relatively new concept. And is it possible that what we're seeing now with these problems with food insecurity is a result of that? So we need to really investigate our economic systems and how they leave people behind, and how, having food is such a basic requirement. So I want to throw that out there and then we'll get into the chat. Make sure that you're unmuted.
Teresa, you're on mute. Teresa, you're on mute.
Myself am on mute. How about that? So Brother Eric, does the organization have a timeline regarding the co-op market in the community?
Yes, it's a fleeting timeline because we don't know. However, our goal and our hope is to have the grocery store up and operational by 2023 is in ideal terms, but we don't know. We have reason to believe that is possible because of the latest, big, development for us. It's not big when it comes down to, like, I guess, if you have a chain grocery store that has many locations. But for us, we finished at the end of last year a preliminary market study, and have hired a consultant who's helping us with our pro forma. For all of those who don't know what that means, essentially allows us to look at all of our financial statements and think about all of the scenarios that we have at our disposal. That gives us a picture of how much money we need to raise and all of that. So based on that pro forma, we are in a position where we believe that we would be able to, somewhere around late 2023, 2024. It's a matter of strategic strategy at that point, but that is what we're thinking at this time.
Thank you. I hope that answered your question, Carol. And the next isn't really a question, but I think it should be posed to all the panelists. This person, they say, Kelly Wilker says, I'm a rising senior at Towson University and food policy has been my passion. What would you recommend to someone wanting to make a career in this field? So I guess I can go out to all the panelists.
So I can start with part of the answer. So you need to have experience in the food system. So it means working on urban farms, food retail, food assistance, many spectrums of direct work experience in the food system will guide you and kind of help influence, your views on food policy. So I think that many pathways, people think food policy, you should just study policy and get internships on policy, but never really get experience in the field of food systems. So I think you need to have a combination of both.
Would anybody else like to add?
I would say exactly the same thing. I would say, as someone who graduated from college with a degree in international relations, I went to work and then 2 years later said, like, I need a hard skill. Like, what's my hard skill here? Is it, I don't know what it is. So I went back and found something. So I would say, look for that door in that gives you practical experience in some piece of the food policies, food systems world. It could be mapping, it could be other things. So I would look for something specific and then start there. You can continue to, like, the journey is long, right? You can keep winding down that road as you get more experience and you move through the work, but find something to start with and it'll make the entry point a little easier.
And I would say, I don't know about the other stuff, so I can't really speak to that, but I would say that any area that you might find yourself in food system work and ultimately in food policy, political education, I think is important. And that's what I would say. I would offer up, the opportunity to potentially study with us, but I think, and I teach this to the team, look, who your teachers and your guides are will shape how you move in this space. And whether they be mentors or otherwise. And I'll do a shameless plug. We do political education and looking forward to training up people and creating cohorts of people who are doing all the work that we could think about in the food system, but who are carrying a radical approach to that, to whatever work that we find ourselves. And then secondly, an apprenticeship program, our what we call our fire keepers in training. Our mantra is keep the flame. So the apprenticeship program allows for practical experience outside of the classroom, if you will. So that's what I would say, regardless of where you find yourself in food system work or ultimately in policy, you want to be have rooted consciousness in what you hope to do. So what you're reading, what you're studying, who's guiding you will shape what kind of policy practitioner you'll be. And so if you want to be a radical one, learn from the radicals. If you want to be anything else, learn from others. But that's what I would say ultimately.
I think this next question, this is an interesting question, and it kind of comes out of the last question. This is from an anonymous attendee. But what role does federal food policy play in supporting food apartheid?
Eric, I wanted you to go first on this one and for me to follow.
You to go first. He's given that to
Where?
you.
Okay, I'll take it then. So
yeah, no, I'm happy. That's what I was thinking, like where to start, right? I'd say that there's so much wrong with federal food policy, and maybe I'm not the best person to speak to federal food policy as I am to speak to federal food practice. And I think we saw that with the politicization of the farmers to families boxes. We know that USDA commodities programs are steeped in a history of wanting to provide economic benefits to white farmers for products that they can't sell or overproduce. And there's just a lot. There's a lot to that. I would say, as someone who works in an organization that does run we do have some federal programs at the food bank. It's a small percentage of what we do, and we do it with eyes wide open. So there are some things that, for example, we get reimbursed from the USDA to cook and deliver meals for after school programs that are nutritious and kid friendly and made by real people, and kids like them, and it's a good after school meal, and it happens in the summer too. So, you know, I'd say I probably wouldn't paint everything with the same brush, but I do think that there's a lot more power and potential in the non-federal food space, and that it's entirely possible to do this work without relying on federal food programs.
So I'll jump in here, and I'm going to graciously counteract Meg a little bit. I think that our federal food policies need to be more equitable, and we can work around and have been working around forever. And I think that we need to continue with the reauthorization of child nutrition reauthorization that's happening right now, to start to speak into equity into the food system and into the policies, so it is reflecting a more equitable food policy. I reposted an article that was referencing white supremacy. A lot of their references are federal food policies specifically, so I do recommend reading that article.
Where is it exactly posted?
Repeat yourself?
Where is it posted?
I posted it now in the Q&A and in the chat.
Oh, okay. I'm not monitoring the chat. I'm monitoring.
Okay.
Okay. So I don't have any more questions. I guess we can go to the closing if anybody would like to say anything as we go, about what your organizations are doing, what are your needs, perhaps, how can we collaborate in the future, that type of thing. Food resilience, food security, these are all essential topics to me, because as a public health person, food is, as I say, it's a need, and it's one of the most, it's related to health. If people aren't, a lot of health conditions come from poor nutrition. So in moving forward, I guess what I would like to see is Baltimore sister. I'm not the president, Jerry's the president, so I don't want to give her any more work, but I would like to know how your organizations and our organization can possibly move or build into the future in building food resilience and working against food apartheid, and also sovereignty when you're talking about land, because I mean, there is a historic tradition in this country of taking away land from African-American farmers. And it's almost like I feel here we are again, but I guess you just have to keep on struggling. So I think in the future, I'll be in touch with all of you all to see, you know, how can Baltimore cities, sister cities, work into the future. Jerry, would you like to add anything?
No, I was going to say, I absolutely agree wholeheartedly with what you're saying, Teresa, because you know, I think one of the things that we're always aiming to do with these webinars is to really start the conversation, right? So that it leads us to a next step. So informing is valuable, right? Because sometimes you don't know what you don't know. And when we create this type of platform for us to engage, to expose, people listen, and they want to be involved. So I completely agree, and I'm wholeheartedly in support of us being able to take it to the next level and to the next step for sure.
Mm-hmm. Okay, it says here, question in the chat.
I'll pose a question that got into the chat. This is Karen Leggett.
Okay.
How do you teach children who are not food insecure, that this is a problem they need to appreciate, and what can they do about it?
Oh, I'll say, from my perspective, I think having very real age appropriate and developmentally appropriate conversations about the inequities that exist, and you know, really explaining why they exist. And it goes back to, at the end of the day, political education. Our public school systems are not teaching that. And so we have to create spaces for it. And so our kitchen table, our front porch with a glass of, you know, lemonade and tea or whatever it might be, or playing cars and choo-choo trains, or, you know, playing with dolls or whatever it might be, or just having a family hike is the best container and environment to have those conversations. But I would also say that it's the same thing for people who are not children as well. I think that is getting clear about, that has been the linchpin, I believe, for why we haven't dealt with issues, because we ignore them, because they're difficult to have, and so we don't have them, and it's not my issue. So, and I think, Teresa, you bring up a very good point. I think that we have not only a history of not talking about the things that we got to talk about, and damn sure, well, maybe I shouldn't say damn, sorry. Is
That's all
damn
right, we're all adults here.
all right. Daggone sure, just in case. If you're not able to, talk about it, you're not going to do anything about it. But I think equally important, attaching these issues to some of the foundational values and principles of this country. We got to be able to be real about that, right? Imperialism, when you talk about there's a tendency, a nature, and a normalcy around dominance, not just taking Black farmers' land, but indigenous people's lands before, extracting labor from people. And you can't disconnect that history from the corner store that operates in a community that's also extracting wealth. It's all the same, just different forms. And so I think that, to your point, Jerry, I think information is one piece of it, but also just getting clear that, like, a pandemic only did one thing, in my opinion. It lifted the veil of an endemic that has always been present, and that endemic is racism and white supremacy and the ways it shows up in communities like mine. And I think that we got to be not only sensitive to that, we got to be willing to study to figure out the nuances and how it plays out, and think about the policy implications, the economic implications. Meg said something, and I listened very intently. Yeah, I think you either got yourself in trouble or inviting a good conversation about how your organization can support work on the ground in Baltimore, procuring food from Black farmers in particular. I'm gonna follow up with you on that, I promise you. But it's those types of things. How do we, the real deal, I believe, in our movement work has to be, and it's linked to that question of how do we teach young people, we have to make, not just having these conversations, we have to make shifts to our lives in everyday struggle. When I talk about movement, I'm not talking about out there and whatever. I'm talking about it start right there. It starts right here. How do I benefit from systems of oppression? All of us, not just non-Black folks, because y'all got a lot of work to do too. But also, how do we benefit from white supremacy, right? You know what I'm saying? Me with my 2 college degrees and all that BS or whatever. How do I benefit, and how do, in that privilege that I've gained, how do I help? And so I think that for me is what I think we got to do. Open those spaces to have real conversations that are developmentally appropriate, and that's real. We're not going to change it if we keep acting like it don't exist. We don't live in a post-racial society. We do not, and we probably won't. But if we continue to do the work and not just see politicians as the people who got to do the work, we got to do it. So, this is a part of the work, but continuing to figure out what that looks like in dialogue and in relationship. Important. The building blocks of social movement are relationships, not rhetoric, not jargon. It's relationship. So how do we build relationship enough where I can challenge Holly and celebrate her in the same call? And she understands where I'm coming from. That's relationship. You get what I'm saying? So for me, I think that it's about being real with ourselves, being real with our children, about like, this is a problem that we've inherited, all of us. What do we do about it? And recognize what our roles are in it. So I'm going to be quiet because I can talk about this.
Yeah, I want to add something to what you said. And then there's there's a question that came up in the chat. But in addition to knowing what's happened in the past, we have to acknowledge what has happened in the past in terms of those who have contributed. The reason I say that is I hear about sustainability and somebody so-and-so has written a new book. I hear about this. And the thing interesting is when you think about somebody, I mentioned this to you, Eric, in our conversation, when you think about George Washington Carver, who's the father of sustainability, but for some reason he's been pushed to the back and we all only know him as the Peanut Man. But if you read his work and you read what he was doing, and there are others as well, it's the same as somebody like in public health with W.B. Du Bois, who is the father of the social determinants of disease. But we don't talk about that. We accredit some Europeans to talking about that. And we don't look and say, hey, these people have been doing and fighting and for a long time. How do we take what they've done and innovate what they've done and move into the future? So question from Linda Cato. You have opened me up to the new ways of looking at hunger and food policy. It's so much more holistic, interdisciplinary, and lays bare the socioeconomic and racial inequities that drive food insecurity. In addition to donations, what you can recommend for senior citizens living in Montgomery County is to do more volunteering. And I think, only because I had a very long conversation with Eric, but in terms, I know of the, please, we're gonna put some information out so that you can continue to contribute financially to these organizations, but there are other ways of contributing as well that aren't necessary. Oh, money's always good, I'm not gonna lie, but there are other ways to contribute. So I don't know if anybody wants to talk about that, where they can go to contribute to these organizations, if you want to put it in the chat, or other type of non-monetary contributions that you can make.
Yeah, I would just underscore, I think that volunteering is a great way to, it does two things. One, it allows you to do something, but more importantly, allows you to learn something, right? It's a great place for conversation, for dialogue, for asking questions, for walking away and going, I don't really understand how this works. Why, or I have these follow-up questions. Like it opens a door for you that allows you to promote your own self-learning. So I think, and I was going to suggest too, even for kids, I mean, there are farms that you can go and you can pull plants out of the ground, and you can have conversations around who owns the ground and who gets the food. And, it's up to the parents to guide the conversation, obviously, and hopefully everyone's, half as educated as Eric, which I doubt. But, I do think that it's a place to foster conversation and dialogue. Volunteering is a great place to do that. You can look on our website. You can volunteer at the Maryland Food Bank. But there's lots of places, and our volunteer coordinators can help connect you with, if you wanted to do other things, they're a great source of information around what's out there. Local community-based organizations that we work with are always looking for help. So that's, I think, a great way to start.
I would say certainly, of course, I agree with that. And I'm not shy about money. The only reason why we do what we do, change costs, right? So I would say, please donate. In addition to that, if you feel like volunteering is one way, but also, maybe I misread this, but it was, asking about, thinking about a senior citizen. It's like, if, a monetary contribution isn't appropriate, those conversations with folks who you socialize with and connect with, and I maybe might be difficult during COVID, but I'm gonna go with the the stereotype, and I'm only for joking purposes. I don't want nobody to mess me up. But when you're at bingo and you're playing cards and you're having drinks and happy hour, that's the time to have the conversation. When you're at your church functions or other faith institutions, whatever, those are having conversations with your people. That's the hardest part. You can talk to me all day about the stuff. What about the folks that you actually are going to the mosque with, or the synagogue, or the folks that you're having family dinner with? What are you talking about with those folks? That is where the real organizing happens. And again, I would say political education. If you're not opposed to some young folks, teaching you, and you feel like you want to go beyond allyship and you're interested in helping to support liberation, shoot me an email, ejackson@blackyieldinstitute.org, and we can, talk further. But while I talked about our work having to be led by Black people, we didn't get into this by ourselves. And so if you feel like you got something to contribute, then we can talk about that. But your money, connection to your networks, political education, those are good ways at least to get started, in addition to just checking your own heart and figure out why you actually want to do more, right? If it's out of guilt, don't do it. But if it's because you believe that your liberation is tied with ours, then let's do it together.
Thank you. I want to thank all the panelists for a wonderful evening with a lot of information. We will be in touch with you to see how we can build with you and create food resilience. from multiple perspectives. I think that's what it is. And you're right by saying that we need to work with each other and build relationships in order to move to the next level, because it has to happen. Because what's happening now is it's what's been happening all the time. We just visibly see it now, but it's not really surprising to me. So we're going to say good evening. I would ask if the BSC people could stay online for this is in the panelists for 2 minutes, because I want to say something, but I'm saying good night to everybody.